Good. I have somebody that wants to tell you something.
Thank you, Dr. Kruse, for helping my dad.
Okay, no problem.
All right, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, you absolutely changed my life, brother. So I can't thank you enough. I had hoped to be able to get you and Dr. Anthony Chafee together and have a discussion, but it hadn't. It has not worked out. What I would really love to do is follow up on your trip to Suriname, have a discussion on taking that quantum leap from cancer as a metabolic disease to cancer as an electromagnetic condition. You've just laid out some unbelievably beautiful points that question the whole paradigm. So I just I just want to really understand cancer from your perspective and some of these
Well,
options.
it's gonna be simple. This morning, Alexis got into some bullshit with Michael Levin,
Okay.
and she texted me, and she was really pissed off with some of the stuff he said. So I basically wrote a 37, 36 tweet thread on Twitter this morning
Okay.
to show him what a dumb fuck he really is. And then also, I put in the thread why Pollock is shitting the bed and also put the experimental proof of how to prove all of this right. It is the biggest major fuck you could ever imagine. But guess what? It's also why Thomas Siegfried also is wrong. The entire thread is a masterclass. So I'd say if you want to talk about that, then I would say what you need to do is probably go read that thread, and then I'll come back here in a half an hour, and then you're going to go, okay. You'll have other questions. You'll understand why me sitting down with Anthony Chafee is an absolute waste of time. Because until he understands 10% of what's in that thread, I promise you should go read it.
Okay. No, and
That's
I
really
absolutely
what you
will.
want to talk about.
Okay. Dr. Cruz, there is nobody, I promise you when I say this as axiomatically truth, nobody that has devoured more of your content in the last 18 months than I have. I mean, just period. So I know that's going to be absolute gold, but I feel like we can absolutely have a beautiful conversation around this, and then I'm going to dive into that and break it down in every possible way that I can. So with what you said, because it's ironic, not ironic, but I just had Dr. Seafried on, okay, and he was a couple episodes ago, and I know that he's missing a whole lot, but for 99% of the people that follow cancer and they're trying to understand that, they don't, and so you have talked so much about SV40. I talked to Judy Mikovits yesterday, and she said SV40 has actually been in every vaccine since '53 through the Vero E6 germline. That was new. If that's right, that's terrifying. It has even larger ramifications than just Pfizer. And so, if the other thing I really needed to talk to you about is Arkansas has an ivermectin over-the-counter bill. We're still in this. Ivermectin is killing people. It's a horse worm, or it's all this crap. And because of the pathology that cancer actually is versus what that paradigm is, you can't even talk to a lot of these people. And so, again, I think that's why this conversation is so important. And I promise you, I will devour your X thread.
Yeah, I'm just going to tell you, I'm not interested in talking to any food gurus at all.
Fair.
They're
Fair.
not. They're not at my level, and until they get to that level, look, this guy Dr. Tro. I told him to go talk to Alexis. Alexis talked to him. She said the guy that was with him in the podcast is smarter than he is. And the same thing with Chafee. Every time I see it, and not only that, I got to be honest with you, Chafee. I mean, I'm embarrassed to call him a neurosurgeon, and the reason why is he's so simplistic. He's basically at Sean Baker's level, which is it's just not good. And when you're dealing with cancer, especially the type of cancer that we have to deal with now with the jabs, this is this is a totally different level than, say, regular run-of-the-mill cancers that are tied to a metabolic disease. So to get to the SV40 level, you actually have to understand the basics of actually how cancer really happens. And if you don't understand truly what mitochondria are doing and how they transform energy from electrons and protons to light, I mean, there's no sense of having this discussion because you lose it.
Fair. Well, I think that's where we've got to get the savages, right? Like to your point, and that little boy that just said thank you to you. That, I mean, he's my why, right? Stage 4 WIMS, and we're here 5 years later, and a large part of staying on top of it is your work. So, the aspect of, let's just go into Becker's work, right? I think that the fact that red blood cells can turn into stem cells is absolutely lost on every bit of medicine that there is, right? And so I have blown many people's minds by relaying that was in there. You pointed it out. I didn't find it. I went back and fact checked. I confirmed it's absolutely in there. And so what they're not, and I don't understand this, I'm gonna be honest, to have a red blood cell without mitochondria and DNA to de-differentiate into a stem cell is wild, right?
Well,
So,
I mean, you're talking about the end stage, but here's the part that you're really missing. This is the reason why I'm telling you that thread on Twitter, you're missing a lot. What was the stimulus?
DC.
Bioelectricity. Extremely, extremely small currents. So when you hear that, okay, I remember this is the whole issue why Alexis was pissed with Levin. This guy, Levin, is supposed to be the guy picking up Becker's work about bioelectricity. And he's now out there saying, well, non-native EMF isn't even that big a deal. Think about what you just said. That's the nexus of where the problem is. And, when I challenged him last night, I said to him, I said, look, I said, the bottom line is you're afraid of your funding. And he said, no, I'm not. He goes, the, the world has completely changed. As soon as he said that, I knew he was full of shit. I knew that he was working for DARPA. And you need to realize when a guy who's supposed to be in the centralized paradigm taking over Becker's work tells you that, this is how you know it's going to get buried, because he's the only guy that can get funding for bioelectricity. Even Alexis knows that because she's in that space. She goes, anytime you start talking about bioelectricity, if you don't have a DARPA or Army background, you're going to get fucked. So that's why I say, if you don't understand the de-differentiation of the red cell is such old news, but the real story is the trillionth of an ampere of bioelectricity. So what does that tell you about the external milieu? What if you can't create the protection scheme to keep that level of coherence to do that? That's actually what cancer is. So you need to understand, well, how do we maintain this coherence? Now, you would think a guy like Pollock would have listened to me. Actually, in that thread, I put my fuck you to Pollock too. This is the reason why his book doesn't go far enough. It's also the reason why Siegfried isn't far enough, because they don't realize that the real story of creating a trillionth of an ampere of electricity or trickle is actually related to the quantum spin of protons. And those protons come from food. It's food stripped down to electrons and protons. If you don't understand how the wiring game and the biophysics is, this is the reason why the guys that have the biochemistry basis, they shit the bed. This is the reason I don't want to talk to Chafee. I don't want to talk to Tro. I don't want to talk to any of them because I know they're wrong. They don't even know the basics. So how could you have, it's kind of like you being a farmer. It'd be like you debating somebody who's an electrical engineer about how farming works. And you should take that thread and show your boy Chafee. Show it to him. Not only that, it's got all the sites all the way through it.
Yeah, no,
Read all the
absolutely.
stuff. See if I'm bullshitting you. I mean, this is what we know. I argue from first principles. Food gurus don't even argue from first principles. They argue from what's present in their books. And their books are like
Are wrong.
history books written by the victors of big pharma and big food.
So I have gone back and listened to some of your work from, I mean, even as far back as I think one of them was 2011, but even 2015. And you were so far ahead back then, and the pieces are starting to come together, like clear, that if anybody looked at them, it would be basics. So when you say this, I get your frustration. I get your frustration with trying to get people caught up. I don't think that's your job. I think our job is to catch up. And as a layman without any sort of initials after my name, I feel very fortunate to be pointed in so many different directions. You have laid out little tidbits that you do not catch in the first maybe 3 times of listening to a podcast. There are some of yours, like every one of Alexis's, I bet I've listened to at least 8 times. And so my point of saying that is when you have broken down how the mitochondria work, the relationship of melanin, you even bring in Vogel crystals and talking about the how that functions within the entire system. It's incredible how you tie that together. So this is why I think your work is fundamental to the future of cancer treatment. I think it's everything, but my world is cancer. So can you lay out if anything that you found in Suriname that is a part of this story, that if this is something that we're going to be able to have some hope going forward for what we just got hammered with?
Hope, yeah. This is the side of hope. The biologic answer is definitely out there. It's where we were left with the Danny Jones story about the Cutter incident. We had the 2 smartest doctors in the world at their time, Sarah Stewart and Mary Sherman, did not figure out how to solve the puzzle of that was SV40. If you look at the 3rd podcast I did with Danny, at the end, right at the end, it was me, Mary, Tally Bowden, and Danny. At the end of the podcast, I show a slide. That slide basically shows you the cancer wave of the Cutter event. And right at the end, on the bottom right, it shows you almost an asymptotic line that goes straight up. That is the line from the COVID jabs. And if you look at the difference between those two, you'll notice that the slope of the line, because the scale of the slide is the same, the slope in the Cutter incident's like this, the COVID one is like this. So this one should really catch you. If you're even if you're not a scientist, you say, why is the slope of these 2 lines different? Turns out this one here, the Cutter incident, this was the whole genome of SV40. This one here is only the SV40 promoter. So what is already the data telling us? The SV40 promoter by itself is a problem. Now, you just said you talked to Judy Minkowitz. She's been talking about this, but dancing around the subject, in my view, because she's got an axe to grind with the people that screwed her, namely Fauci. I don't think she even realizes the difference. Why? Because SV40, after the bioweapons research that was done in New Orleans, became basically a tool of genetic research. And what did they do? They started using SV40 promoters in a lot of different lab experiments, but not realizing how this potentially can affect what they're doing. So because vaccines have never gone through rigorous testing, that's what you hear from Bobby Kennedy, what he wrote about in his book. What needs to happen, the first thing that needs to happen to validate some of the things that Minkowitz says, because we don't know what she's saying is true or not. Do I believe her, or should I say, is it more probable than not that she's correct? The answer is yeah. I think they have used the SV40 promoter in many diseases. And why is this plausible? It's plausible because that's exactly what happened with Pfizer. In this COVID thing, when they decided to release it, the real big issue was Pfizer wasn't ready. So what did they do? They went 3 floors down, as I said to Breedlove in the podcast recently, and they got their genetic tool and they were able to catch up to Moderna. And what did they do? Then they used some technology that Kevin McKiernan has been absolutely an expert at describing how they removed their fingerprint of what they did. What happens to prove what Minkowitz has said, you need a guy like Kevin to go back and genetically sample every single vaccine that's on the schedule and find out, was the same thing done there? My bet is you're going to find out that there's a lot more of them that have used this issue. Now, why somebody's listening to this think, why would, the centralized paradigm do something when they know it's going to get people sick? Here's the part that nobody wants to hear. I told you all in the Danny Jones podcast very clearly, the government has figured out how to taper the Ponzi scheme of $37 trillion. Well, if you load a nuclear weapon into your DNA, and it means over the next 20 to 50 years, you're going to get cancer, this goes directly to what Larry Ellison and Lutnick said in the Oval Office with Trump saying there, that we should have warrants. Remember, a warrant on treatment so that we can get paid to do this. So guess what the financialization of healthcare is saying? Cancer is a strong business. Now, you're in Arkansas, rural state. What is the main driver of healthcare in the United States? It's not even close. It's cancer care. So guess what? Big Pharma sits at the Cantillon effect of the printer. Those are the two guys, Ellison and Lutnick, telling you how they financialize healthcare. They took a really bad story from the Qatar event and they figured out how to make massive amounts of money. This is the Wall Street guys who add nothing to the economy, but have figured out how to make a huge thing. And you're this little small dude with a kid with cancer in Arkansas that doesn't even realize the cartel that you're going up against. You're hitting at some of the pillars when you talk to Kevin, you talk to Alexis, you talk to Minkowitz. But here's the problem. You have to zoom out. You have to understand the totality of the problem. When you sit down and you talk to Chafee, Dr. Tro, or Siegfried, these guys are focusing on one area, and the area they're focused in on, they still have myopia. And their myopia is a Dunning-Kruger effect. I would say out of all the guys I just mentioned, Siegfried is the closest because he's correct. Cancer is a metabolic disease. But when you say that, you have a duty to understand mitochondria. Thomas Siegfried doesn't understand the first fucking thing about mitochondria. Why? Because he's a biochemist, food guru only guy. So that's why I told you before we started this podcast that you need to understand the biochemistry only gets you so far. You have to understand the biophysics. And it turns out the biophysics are the most important part for the cancer story. That's the reason why we have this really unusual thing. Like if you're a smart person, you don't have to be, rocket scientist, brain surgeon smart, but you go like this. Why is it that a chemical that we found in a forest adjacent to a golf course in Tokyo that has a huge therapeutic index, that's used for parasites, that's cured river blindness in the world, that's off patent, somehow people have found that it works in cancer? That should stop everybody dead in their tracks, but it hasn't. In fact, the paradigm that's in power, the paradigm that's in partnership with Lutnick, Ellison, Trump, those are the Borla guys. Those are the people tied to the bankers. This is why I keep telling you, the bankers and Big Pharma are one and the same group. They know the deal. That's the reason why ivermectin isn't over the counter. It's why Fenben is not being given away on every street corner where they sell hot dogs. Okay? Because remember, what their goal is to make sure they can taper the Ponzi scheme. They already have one idea. If you want to know what the big issue is going on right now, because this is really a big view. The big issue that's going on right now, central banks, the banking elite, are trying to use a neutral asset, namely gold. That's why you hear all this craziness going on in the UK and Europe and the United States now. The UK is actively moving gold into the United States. Prior to 1971, from 1948 to 71, the United States lost, we think they went from 18,000 metric tons of gold to about 8,800 tons. And if you remember, which you probably don't, the French government actually sent army ships, I should say Navy ships, to New York City to pick their gold up and bring it back. This is in the 60s and early 70s, before Nixon closed the gold window. So when you understand this, this is where your boys, and when I say your boys, I'm talking about Ellison and Lutnick, come in. This is before them, but they are the modern version of what happens. These are like the Sandy Wheels. All the people in Wall Street figured out how to securitize or financialize healthcare. In fact, humanity, your life. And that's what they started to do. They basically, the United States hollowed out all their manufacturing base, because what do we manufacture? We manufacture dollars. We create dollars for the world. So we are effectively now trading dollars for human life. That's the story of healthcare since 1971. And when you understand that, and you understand that the most profitable part of centralized medicine since 1971, by virtue of what happened between Sarah Stewart, Mary Sherman, and Alton Osher, is that cancer is the actual gift that keeps on giving. Why? Because you can make huge amounts of money from chemotherapy, huge amounts of money, because people who have cancer tend to have prolonged high treatment lives. That's kind of what they do. This is the reason why chemotherapeutic drugs are so expensive in the United States. I don't give a shit what cancer you have. It's all by design. And this is how, and this is why a guy like Lutnick and Larry Page could sit in the Oval Office with Donald Trump and actually with a straight face say what they said, and expect 360 million people not to understand what they just said. This is the reason why very few doctors, I'm going to talk about 0.001%. I'll give you the list of names who I think are tied to this. Me, Mary Talley Bowden, William Mackus, Pierre Corey, Dr. Malik, I think Paul Merrick, Simone Gold. Those are just few of the names off the top of my head. You know, are there other people that aren't doctors, not clinicians? Yeah, Jessica Rose, Kevin McKiernan, Philip Buchholz. Those are the people in. Let me ask you something, my friend. Did I mention a food guru in there?
No.
So remember what the big thing was in the second Danny Jones podcast, bringing Callie Means on, who now has been plugged into the Maha movement. Okay? Why? Because we need to sidetrack the story that you and I are talking about, so we go back to the food story. So when you have food guys on, or you tell me, hey, I want you and Anthony Chafee to talk around. Do you know who Anthony Chafee is to me? He is Callie Means. You know who Thomas Siegfried is to me? He is Casey Means. They're not going to get us to where we need to go. And here, you're banging your head up in Arkansas, want to know, Jack, why isn't this paradigm changing? It's because you keep highlighting fucking people who will never get you there. Got it?
Fair.
And it's not just you. It's everybody. Because you know what? The discussions that those people have, they're easy to understand. Okay? That's why it rings. That's not how we work at all. That's not how it works.
Jack, I'm over those conversations. I'm just gonna be honest with you. I really am over the conversation. I don't want to talk about food. I don't give a shit about food. That's not even what I want to do. The basic level, you're right. I get it. I don't have enough people to talk to yet, so I just continue to devour your work and go back and recycle and keep going deeper and doing my best as a country boy to understand it and apply it. Like, I just want to save my son and rid the world of cancer. That's it. That's all I want.
It's pretty simple. You don't realize that you, as a simple country boy, are doing it every day. None of the plants that are growing in your yard right now get cancer. That's where you start. So you need to start asking the food gurus when you talk to them, tell me, why is that the case? Why does living things that I grow in Arkansas never get the problems that my son's got? Start there. Like, be agent provocateur, because guess what? That's actually where the story starts. If you want to know the truth, I think you've done yourself a disservice here thinking that you're the dumbass. No, I think the people that you talk to are the dumbasses. Why? Because you know something that they don't know. You're an expert in growing food utilizing the photosynthetic web. And you know that food is a photosynthetic story. So what you need to do is start taking the wisdom that I give you about what mitochondria are really doing in deciphering that electromagnetic barcode and start asking the food gurus the questions. I told you before we got on today, there's 37 tweets on a Twitter thing. Ask them those questions. Take each one and say, if we know this, tell us how this fits into your paradigm. And just sit back and watch. And when they say, well, I don't have that understanding, say, okay, then how can you tell us about disease?
You're spot on. I specifically asked Seafried about Gilbert Ling's saying that ATP is not enough to power the body. And
what do you say?
He doesn't know anything else that could. And so, like, honestly, at that point, I'm done.
He's
right?
the guy.
Like, I just shut down.
He's the guy you're going to have discuss cancer with you. You're going to look at all his papers like cancer is a metabolic disease. So guess what? He's right about that. But that's where his knowledge ends. Got it? That's the problem. And the same thing is true, with what you just talked about with Becker's work. When you told me, Jack, the most amazing thing, I read Becker's work, I get it. I understand the DC electric current. I understand Burr founded first in plants, and I'm a farmer. That's why I'm interested in it. But what I didn't know is how a red blood cell that has no DNA in it can de-differentiate into another cell, in fact, any cell in the body, and actually regenerate and repair us. And we lose that ability when we have cancer. That is a stunning development. And the thing that controls that is bioelectricity. And it comes from the sun. How does that process happen? Because guess what? That is the story of really what happens in cancer. How is the fidelity of the signal ruined in mitochondria that allow that process to happen in your sun? That is the story. Because that's what all cancers are linked to. It's a problem with the fidelity of the signal from the outside to the mitochondria where the cancer manifests. And when you begin to understand that it's an electromagnetic signal that gets polluted, I told you before we started that Dr. Levin made the most ridiculous comment I've ever seen on Twitter. But it also is good because it tells you he's just like Chafee. He's just like Siegfried. He's just like the rest of them. He doesn't understand the basic phenomenon that Becker found. 1/1,000,000th of an amp of bioelectricity was able to transform a cell so that you could regenerate bone, so you could regenerate a fingertip, so that you could regenerate from cancer. So think about this. Do you think all the things from the National Cancer Institute that are chemotherapeutic agents, do you think those might interfere with that 1/1,000,000th of an amp?
Absolutely.
Do you think the glyphosate that's in your fields may do that? Do you think the water in Arkansas, the water table that's likely been polluted from all the geoengineering that everybody keeps posting on X, might have an effect on that? Well, when you read that 37 tweet thread that I put out today, you're going to find out that just a small change in the nuclear spin of an atom in the key things that are around you can change that bioelectric signature. That is where cancer comes from. It doesn't come from your food. Your body does a great job of stripping out protons and electrons. But you know what it doesn't do a great job at? It has to protect the nuclear spin of things in you. And it can't do that when you're living in Chernobyl, which is what everybody's doing. And when you understand, when you live in Chernobyl, that the body's job gets exponentially harder to do, so it has to expend more energy for the protection scheme. And if you don't have enough energy to protect, then guess what happens? You lose that bioelectric signature that Becker taught you about, that Michael Levin knows about, but doesn't understand. Because remember, he is really good on the biochemistry side, but has no idea about nuclear spins and how nuclear spins are coded for. Like everything that I'm telling you right now is published in the literature. You know what the problem is? Alexis Cowan, Michael Levin, Dr. Becker, Jack Kruse prior to 40 years ago never read the biophysics literature. In fact, how disgustingly bad is this? My biggest beef with Jerry Pollack for 15 years, he doesn't even read the appropriate biophysical literature. He reads the stuff when it's tied to water, but not tied to everything else. And when you understand that deuterium and the hydrogen proton have different nuclear spins, do you think it would have dawned on Pollack, hey, maybe I need to check the difference between DDW and regular water that have a totally different dielectric constant? In fact, you, my friend Logan, can easily do what Pollack refuses to do. You know what you should do? You should do this with your sons that I met right before this podcast. You should take 2 identical plants out of your garden, okay? In fact, I'd say 3 plants each. Feed one of them, feed them all the same nutrients you would do, but the only change I want you to do is give one DDW and the other one not. And then come back and report to your audience what the difference is. And then you know what you should do? Then you should have Pollack on and say, tell me how this happened. Because guess what? You're just going to pull the curtain back on the wizard, and this is what he's going to say to you. Oh, this is very, very interesting, but I need more money to study this. Because that's what he's been saying to me for 15 years. Yeah. But guess what? We don't need more money to study it because it's the simplest thing in the world to test. So what did I do in this thread today? I gave you the setup exactly how to do it. In other words, I'm doing his work for him. I'm not even asking him or Levin to think. I did the thinking for them. And I just showed you, as a simple guy in Arkansas, how you can stick the thorn in their side by taking the same exact plants with the same shitty sunshine in Arkansas, and the only thing you change is the water that you use to feed those plants. You know what you'll find? That the water that gets the DDW has a 40% higher yield than the one that doesn't. And then you might say to yourself, so Jack, are you trying to tell me that the reason why my son got cancer is that he had a decreased yield because his mitochondria wasn't able to make DDW water? That's exactly what I'm saying. And then I'm going to take my fingers and put them in your nose and pull you all the way down to that plant. I'm going to say, look at the plant. What's the message that nature's whispering in your ear? Deuterium has a different magnetic moment, a different nuclear spin than H+. Hey, you're a farmer. I know they didn't teach you that in farming school, but maybe you want to learn about it because it's the key to why this happened. You, a simple guy that doesn't know anything else, can do an experiment to blow their worldview up instead of having guys like Siegfried, Pollack, Chafee come on and keep spewing the bullshit that they spew to you. Ask them to explain that to you. And then say, you guys know that our mitochondria is filled with H+. It's got no deuterium in it. Could that be a clue how plants and us are kind of the same, but not the same? Could it be the reason why humans get disease? Because maybe, just maybe, when we change the isotope of things in us that have different nuclear spins, it means we have not the right amount of bioelectricity, and maybe, just maybe, that's how my son got the tumor that he got. Your son is just like he's just like a houseplant. He's just a little bit more complicated. And I just pulled the sheet down to show you why he's a little bit more complicated. His nitride cage has got iron in the middle. Your plant that you grow out in your yard, it's
Magnesium.
got chlorophyll, magnesium in it. The difference between those two are electrons. But you need to understand that story that perturbed you from Becker's book when you went back and reread it and said, let me explain something to you, because you said it before and I didn't interrupt you. You said you can read something for me or watch a podcast and get new insights over every time. Do you know why that happens? Because you are seeing the same thing but with new eyes. You're not realizing you're updating your knowledge base as you go. So when people watch or listen to something I've done, when they start to get wiser, they should go back and listen to what I said, because guess what? There's going to be a lot of things that you didn't think were important the first time that turn out it's really important. And the more of this you learn about Becker's work, this is my big beef with, Attia, Sabatini, Siegfried, Dom D'Agostino, all of them, Sean Baker, Tro, Chafee. Quantum electrodynamics is the story of details. And it turns out you have to stack huge knowledge to get to where we're going to truly help people that have cancer. And if you really want to help them with longevity, it's even a bigger deal. Why? Because longevity requires you getting most of the things right and not most of the things wrong. So when those docs are out there telling you, eat this diet one way, and you know that the environment completely varies just in a seasonal basis, that's a mistake. Or when the doctor says, yes, statins are great, the jabs are fine, but they're the longevity expert, you need to go, I don't know. Or when they say cancer is a metabolic disease, but they stop at, Warburg's thesis of glucose metabolism, you go, I think it might be a little bit more complicated than that. That's the point. That's where you come in. As the simple guy, you're like, I know that when I do all this stuff, my plants don't grow as good. So maybe I need to do something different. Or when I feed my animals a certain way versus this way, or I don't turn them out in the field, I don't get as much milk. Or my chickens don't make as many eggs. And it's so funny, when I change the light in the coops, it changes the quality of their egg. It changes the shell. It changes how many eggs they give me. How come I never have thought about what the effect of light is on my kid, and my wife makes my kid wear a tarp to school. And when he goes to school, he's getting irradiated for 8 to 10 hours a day. They don't use books anymore. They use iPads. And then when my son comes home, instead of playing baseball or running in the yard or helping me, he's with his friends playing war game videos on the video game. Is this kind of what we're adapted to and what's normal? Is that, if we did the same thing to your plants, like we put nutrients in the ground and we put shitty water, and then we put a tarp over them, Logan, you're going to get the same plant? But you know that Monsanto sells you chemicals where you can actually geoengineer the earth, right?
Yep.
And they can change seed germination so that even in a shitty environment, you can still grow food. But you now know, because we have optical scanners, that when you grow that tomato and you cut it open, it doesn't have the same biophoton signature that a tomato that's grown normally does. What I just told you is absolutely discoverable in your farming world, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Doesn't Walmart and all the what do you call it, Whole Market and Whole Foods pay more money for things that have a better biophotonic signature? How come we're not doing that with your kid? How come we're not doing it with all our kids? How come pediatricians don't know that? Well, why doesn't anybody want to pay for a vitamin D level? Because guess what? It's kind of like a biophoton counter. You know why? Because Big Pharma doesn't want you to know that. Because you know what vitamin D is probability associated with? Epithelial cancers. And what did we say about cancers? That's the biggest fucking game in town. Like, I don't know what the highest yield in your farm is. I don't know if it's soybeans, tomatoes, or
Tomatoes.
zucchini. Yeah. So if it's tomatoes for you, you make the most money on it. Don't you think you'd want to maximize that? Well,
Of
that's
course.
exactly what Larry Ellison, that's exactly what Donald Trump, that's exactly what Howard Notnick said to you from the Oval Office. You want to know why they're not going to ban the messenger RNA platform? Because they can't take the golden goose away from their partners in Big Pharma. That's your answer. So what does that mean when you hear your own government say that, and you know that your own government, the DoD, was the distributor of the jabs? That means you have to become like Logan and say, I know what I learned when I went to college to grow tomatoes, but I think I'm going to use decentralized wisdom in my garden, and I'm not going to use the centralized ideas that I'm being shilled because I don't think they come from a good place. That is how you avoid cancer. That is exactly how you do it. And anybody who doesn't get that level of sophistication, you have a duty as a decentralized savage to limit how they affect your life. So if
Yes.
you think the food gurus are correct, okay? Because remember, all the food gurus, they look great, look way better than me, but they're the ones dying of the cancer. Guys that look like me ain't dying of the cancer, even though you were told by Fauci those guys were going to die. Eventually, you got to ask yourself the question, why is that?
Okay, so you and Alexis had discussed what happens on the surface is more important than what happens inside. And when you look at Van Wyck's book on chapter 9, it's all about cancer, and it goes into how light dictates metabolism. What I am super curious to do, and why I admire you so much, is you connect things for me that don't seem to be interconnected. When we're looking at some of the things that come out about, say, the epithelial glycocalyx, it seems to me, based on your work, but I've never heard you talk about it, that is an electromagnetic interface. So if that is accurate, that goes and supports what happens on the surface level matters most. Do you have any thoughts on that, on glycocalyx, the surface,
Yeah,
and how?
it's all bioelectricity. This is something that Michael Levin has actually already worked on in his lab and has actually proven that not only is the surface, and when I say surface, let's just make it simple so people can understand it. Your skin. Your skin has tight junctions between each other. When you pour water on your skin, the water doesn't seep into your body. The same thing is true in your brain. You have a blood-brain barrier. Same thing is true in your gut. You have one in your eye. You have one in your testicles. All these barriers are electric. Turns out the glycocalyx in different epithelial cells in your body also is bioelectric. So when you lose this bioelectricity, it breaks down. When it breaks down, what does it immediately tell you? It tells you that the first place where light interacts with us, which is the surface, the bioelectricity is changed for some reason. So it's incumbent upon you as the black swan mitochondria to figure out, okay, what was it? Was it the geoengineering? Was it the food I'm eating? Was it the redox in my body? Was it, hey, did I lose the nuclear spin inside my mitochondria? When you asked me the question before we started the podcast, how and why I started talking to Alexis and Nicole about Vogel crystals, it's pretty simple. Hydrogen plus, which is in your mitochondria, is a liquid crystalline interface. So we know that it's hexagonal, okay, in shape. Tells us that the hexagonal shape inside your mitochondria, like people think the mitochondria is like squishy, but it's a liquid crystalline squishy, meaning when you squish it, electricity and light come out from it. That's the reason why you have all these weird papers that show that mitochondria change their sizes and shapes. When they change their sizes and shapes, what is that to a quantum thermal diagnostician? That tells you a little bit about the redox at that level. Tells you, are they leaking more light? Are they able to make that bioelectricity well? Turns out that's a function of the shape of the crystalline structure that's inside your mitochondria. So remember, because this story you asked me about started with the glycocalyx or the surface of the skin or any of the barriers, what do we know from 1969 and 1970? This is Alan Fry and Russ Addy. This predates, anything that Levin has done. They showed that when you lose your bioelectric footprint, all the barriers in your body open up, or the glycocalyx no longer functions. So what are they physically telling us? They're telling us even that is a quantum electrodynamic phenomenon. And what did Fry do? Fry actually read some of Becker's work, and he got the idea, could I change the calcium ionic frequency around someone and just change the electric signature? The answer is they found that. Who was the guy that found that? A guy named Irv Lippman. Becker actually read some of those papers. It appears to me that Michael Levin did not, because he doesn't seem to know. I think the guy's name was Abe Livoff. That paper was from like 1969, 1970. But that's what asked or created Fry to ask the next question. If I could change the quantum spin of calcium, because remember, calcium is the second messenger that works everywhere in our body, could that affect the bioelectric footprint from a cell? He found out that it could. So when you have somebody like Levin saying publicly on Twitter yesterday what he said to Alexis, this is when you go, look, Levin's probably the best guy we have on our team, but it makes you realize that he's not a Hall of Fame player. He's probably like a modern major leaguer that you'd pay $5 or $10 million for. That's it. But you're not paying him $40 million a year, at all. And when you hear that, and then you talk about some of the cats that you've brought on your podcast, I've already told you, those guys for me, they're $1 or $2 million players on the bench. And if we keep people in this soup, people like your son are never going to get the wisdom they need to get. We need to keep fighting for people to do the right thing. So when you harvest somebody like Alexis out of the biochemical soup and you mix her with somebody who's got money like Nicole, and maybe they can start studying the things that Levin doesn't study, the things that Siegfried doesn't study, the things that never even occur to Chafee, Attia, or Dr. Tro. That is where the answer is. And the mistake you've made in this podcast, you assume because you're not a scientist, you're a little farming dude from Arkansas, that you can't help them. No, I just told you can. Because it turns out the liquid crystalline structure of deuterium depleted water is magically different than tap water. And what's the physical term? I don't expect you to know this. It's the dielectric constant. The dielectric constant goes immediately to the refraction of water. What does the refraction of water tell you? It tells you how good or bad the battery is. It tells you how good electricity and magnetic flux are stored. That's the story that Levin and Pollock, and you don't know. But I just told you how to do it with your boys. I just told you to take 3 plants, one in a control group, one not. You grow them in the same light. Just change the water. I think you should do that because you're coming into the right time, the growing season right now.
Yeah.
And then what you need to do is, I would tell you, time-lapse photography, and then send that before you have Pollock on or Levin on or any of your fucking food guru friends on, and say, hey, this podcast is going to be interesting. I'm going to start it with a time-lapse photography. In other words, you're going to be just like John Ott was. He's like, look at my plants in Arkansas. Look at what my kids did. Okay, now with your understanding, can you explain this to us? Explain it to my audience. Remember, they're food gurus, right?
They can't. I mean, they can't though. That's to
Well,
our point. That's why this
that's
is.
good. That's good. That's good. You're not listening to me. You're not listening to me because you're missing a lesson. When you realize that they can't explain it to you, then you just told your audience, why are we listening to these people? There's your answer. And when you find people that actually can explain bits and pieces and parts, those are the people that you need to amplify through. Because I'm telling you, there's people out there that do get that sophistication. You're like, you know what? They may not know everything, but they can go further levels than all the famous people who are influencers on the internet.
You're right. This is why I appreciate like Alexis so much. Alexis has been on, right, and honing in and amplifying, but also, I feel like Cameron Borg has done a phenomenal job on making some of these things come together, right? I think I get
He
it,
has,
but
but he's too nice. He's too nice to people he shouldn't be nice to. Why? Let me just explain something to you. When you realize that someone is in a round room with padding, the way you get to the foundation is ask them the tough questions. That's all you got to do. The audience is not dumb, dude. They're going to figure it out. I mean, I can tell you from the podcast that I did with Huberman and Rick, you know that Rick is like you. He doesn't really get too deep into the science. He doesn't have anybody with cancer around him. He's got his own issues. But after sitting with me and Huberman for 10 hours, cutting the podcast to 8 or 7, whatever it was, he's like, yeah, I think I learned something about my friend Andrew. Got it? So, in other words, you can continue to listen because you find it entertaining. But when you realize that he's a proxy for centralized science and the Stanford Research Institute, and you realize that's where Callie and Cassie Means are, that's their level of understanding, then you begin to understand why Howard Lutnick and Larry Page get the stage with your president. You begin to understand why your president is pumping shit coins instead of really getting Bitcoin into the government. In other words, it begins to explain a lot of things to you so that they can't lie to you anymore. In other words, the wounds create the wisdom. See, the really smart people in the world, they can sit down with a bunch of bullshit marketers and people that spew half truths. You don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You take what's good, but you throw the garbage away and you realize these people can only get me this far. And the way you do that as a podcaster is by the questions that you ask. And the questions you ask need to be probing. It's the same thing, that you and I just lived through for the last 4 years. We saw that when the media talked to Kamala Harris and Biden, they got nothing but softball questions, which you see in most podcasts of food gurus. But, like I remember back when Hillary Clinton was running, Matt Lauer, who was also a schmuck, but asked her a tough question. Do you know that right after that, Hillary Clinton was furious that he asked her a good question on camera. Most people don't know this, but that started the path for Matt Lauer getting thrown off TV. All his dirty laundry started coming out. Why? Because Hillary Clinton said, you're not going to do this to me. Just so you understand, why am I telling this story? This is how central paradigms work. In other words, they keep the lie there. You and I are living through this right now. You're finding out that basically taxpayer money was used to fund the media and all the bullshit that people have believed about the paradigm you're trying to change. The things that you're trying to do to help your son. You realize that all that USAID money not only went to enrich Adam Schiff and Nancy Pelosi, and all the people in Congress, which is how they got $80 million from a $200,000 salary, but it's also the reason why Big Pharma got extremely wealthy off your son, and why it gets extremely wealthy from just about every cancer patient that comes in. People don't understand that when the money's corrupt, everything that flows from it is also corrupt. And this story is really important because I look at podcasting very similar to the story of USAID. If you allow people to give you half truths on podcast, it's like censoring material. I feel like if the thing that you wanted me to do with Anthony Chavey, you're like, well, these two guys are neurosurgeons. We're neurosurgeons, but I could put in a thimble what he knows about biophysics. I would tell you that me and Alexa sitting down would be a far better podcast than me and Chafee sitting down. In fact, it would be kind of interesting for your audience because I think the PhD researcher would undress the neurosurgeon in the room. But that's actually what needs to happen because you know what? That shouldn't be censored. The audience needs to know truly what you know. A lot of people will hear this podcast and think I'm talking shit about Michael Levin and Pollock. No, I'm actually saying good things about them. They've done good work, but they need to go further. I believe Jerry not doing the deuterium studies is just like censorship in the media. Like, you write this great book that everybody reads, but you're missing chapters that aren't in there. So the people who are like your son never get to the magic carpet ride. The same thing is true with Thomas Siegfried. Logan, cancer is a metabolic disease. And Logan's going, yeah. Okay, let's go further. Warburg metabolism, and we stop. Bro, you can't. That is censorship in science. And when they say, okay, that's the level that I understand, okay, tell the audience that. In other words, you as the podcaster, ask them that questions, see where their knowledge really stops, and say, okay. And then I would tell you, cut the thing short, and then you tell the people what you found. This is one of the things that podcasters don't do a good job of. They don't look at the interview they just did, watch it back themselves, and say, you know what? Let me tell you what I think was good here. Let me tell you what I think was bad. And let me tell you where I think the edge of the knowledge is for this podcast. And these are the questions that we need to ask. So we need to bring other people on and start asking those questions. You'll be very surprised. And I've said this to many people, and I'm going to say it to you. I told you about that 37 tweet X rant that I went today for Levin. One of the things that I put in there that I guarantee is new for you, I tried to show people, even though the studies haven't been done in Levin's lab or Pollock's lab, they've been done in E. coli, about just changing the isotope fraction of magnesium actually showed us that the ATPase inside of mitochondria of an E. coli will switch. It'll do something different than what we'd expect. And where was this paper done? It wasn't done in the classic journals that you said. But why is this important for you and your son who's got cancer? Because your son's cancer comes from the mitochondria. Mitochondria used to be a prokaryote before we stole it. You know that from Nick Lane's work. So that means if I can show you something on Earth in someone else's lab where the mitochondria in a prokaryote can be forced to change its nuclear spin to still make energy, you're going to go, well, if it can happen in a bacteria and a mitochondria is like a bacteria, why the hell couldn't it happen in our mitochondria? The only step that we need to do is take that next step and check it in our mitochondria, isn't it? So then what did I do in the thread for Levin and Pollock? I said, okay, here's the experimental setup. This is what you should do if you're a black swan. This is the same critique I'm giving to you right now about your podcast. Like, in other words, I listen to what Levin has said in his podcast. I listen to what he said in the tweets last night to Alexis. What did I do? I created that thread today to say, okay, this is the edge of where your knowledge is by your own words. Now I'm going to give you a stage to build on. Like, if you're telling me that funding is no problem and you can get the money, which is what he said, then I'm going to give you the next stage you should play on. So guess what? Anybody who listens to this podcast in the future, anytime they bring Michael Levin on from here on in, they should ask him that question. Did you do those studies, since you're the one that told us you can get money from everywhere? Because everybody doesn't give a shit about non-native EMF. It's exactly what he said out of his own mouth, that he's not constrained by what Becker was constrained at. Remember, this is exactly opposite what Pollock has told everybody. I can't get money to study this. So who's right, Michael or Pollock? My answer is, I actually think they're both right. Why? Because Jerry's work isn't supported by DARPA and the DOD. But Michael Levin's is. And that's something that you haven't heard about straight from the horse's mouth. So why am I being Asian provocateur with you right now? This just happened yesterday. I'm explaining to you how it needs to happen on podcasts. You want to upgrade your podcast? You want to put Joe Rogan to bed? This is how you do it. This is the missing link for podcasts. And podcasters don't understand that it's true. What Trump has said is true. what Elon Musk has said is true. We are now getting our information not from media, not from science anymore. We're getting it from the internet, from what we call trusted sources. I look at Joe Rogan the same way I look at Michael Levin or Gerald Pollack. A lot of it's true, but there's a lot of bullshit in there because of who's paying his bills. He's incentivized to tell you a story. That's what Lutnick and that's what Larry Ellison told you from the Oval Office. The same thing. That system is in place everywhere. Not just politics, not just banking, not just science. So when podcasters begin to understand this and they realize that their guests have a centralized approach to how they talk about things, then you go from there. What do I try to do? I try to use a place like X to bring my decentralized science out there, throw it out there and see who's going to use it. Why? Because the people who use your wisdom, they're the ones with the open mind. Like when people tell you, like Levin said specifically to Alexis, you show me the experimental proof and data, and then I'll change my opinion. So what did he just tell the world? He just told the world, I'm the only one that can get money, so if I don't study it, you're not going to get it. Because Jerry Pollack's told the world, I asked for the money and I can't get it. Alexis has told you she can't get it. So what is Levin really telling you? He's actually telling you the truth.
Wow.
But he's telling you he can get any of the money he wants to study this. But why doesn't he study what needs to be studied? Because if he did, he'd be out of business.
Wow.
No, it's not wow. It's, look, this is, unfortunately, when the money's corrupt, so is the science. And you need to realize everything that's happening on legacy media is actually happening in journals. It's happening to doctors. If you don't think that that's why Mary Talley Bowden is pissed, I mean, look, she's been fighting for ivermectin over the counter for people like your son or the people that took the jab. Right. And look, the therapeutic index for ivermectin is safer than aspirin. But you have people out there like the hospital she works at. Mark Bloom, who's the CEO of that hospital. That's really close to where you live. You don't want to go to a hospital like that. That hospital is telling the same story that Dr. Fauci did. In other words, they're censoring you from the truth. Why the hell would you ever want to go there if you had cancer? Because you know you're only going to get the solutions that they sell. And that's censorship. You know, when their oncologists tell you that we don't think vitamin D plays a role in this at all, they basically told you that we don't think there's any biophysical basis to cancer. That's what they're telling you. But you have to hear that message. And the crazy thing is you disenfranchise yourself. You know a lot more about light than you think because guess what? You grow things that are alive that we eat. That story in your garden is exactly the same story about what's going on in your son. What have I always told you? That you're getting great tomatoes in your yard, but you're not getting children like that. You got to start asking better questions. And that's the same thing I'm telling you when you do podcasts.
Yeah.
Force people into those questions. And when you realize, as the guy asking the questions, that this is their glass ceiling, don't get frustrated. They did your audience a favor. Then your audience is going to know. That's why I think you enjoy talking to Alexis. I think it's why you enjoy talking to Cameron Boyd. I think it's probably why you enjoy talking to Max. When you talk to me, I'm always going to push you. Always. Why? Because the job isn't done. We're not finished. We have people out there that are supposed to be rock stars in science, and I just told you that they're all compromised. Every single one of them are compromised. I just had a guy who I was going to vote for. I think he's compromised now, even though he's the head of HHS. So I know what he's told me. I know what he said. I know what he's done prior to HHS. He's got 100 days to prove to me he's not like Lutnick. He's not like Larry Page. He's not like Donald J. Trump. That he's okay of putting his back to the arrows, And if Trump fires him, great. But did he do it the right way? Is the ghost of his father and his uncle in him? Or has the environment of Washington, D.C., Susie Wiles, Callie and Cassie Means, has that somehow polluted his message so that he's no longer quantum coherent and does all the things that he said in his book about Fauci? That's what I'm waiting to see, my friend.
I sure hope. I sure hope he does. You again. I've said it multiple times. You've changed my life, and you being a drill sergeant with me doesn't it do anything negative. It fuels me. It makes me reevaluate and attack. So I appreciate it. So no, I don't deal with it. I guess the way a lot of other people do. Max, Cameron, and Alexis are about it as far as my close to generation that we can really have a platform and talk about these things. And I respect and appreciate them tremendously. But for you, thank you. None of us would be having these conversations if you hadn't been putting those pieces together and willing to take those arrows. So,
well, just remember though, I want you to expand that group of people though. There's a lot of other people out there. They may not have all the pieces of the kaleidoscope, but they may have a lot of knowledge about certain pieces of that kaleidoscope. You need to expand those people. But when you get them on, you need to push their boundaries. Say, look, this isn't all just about red light. Let's talk about,
absolutely.
Green light and how green light stabilizes hemoglobin, because Jack told me about this whole freaking red blood cell thing and Becker, and nobody's talking about green light and how it stabilizes the red blood cell. And I got a feeling this may be important. And people are going to look at you. I didn't know that. I didn't know that about green light. But guess what? You're learning about that because you know a lot about chlorophyll. You know a lot about how light impacts life. You've read Roland Van Wyck's book. You actually just said to me, Jack, in this chapter, it's about cancer. You're asking me questions about optical density. If you don't think that that's a good thing, that's a spectacular thing. But guess what? That's what I need Thomas Siegfried and Anthony Chaffee to do. What happens when the optical density of your skin, your subcutaneous fat, your arteries, your glycocalyx, the tissues around your mitochondria change? What happens when that happens? Like, that's the question you ask. Like, you say to Judy Minkovitz, well, okay, you're saying SV40s and everything. Tell me about how that would impact the optical density of a mitochondria. And if she looks at you like, say, okay, you gave us the key, but how does this all work? Actually, how do you go from light energy to bioelectricity? Ask Michael Levin that question. Ask Alexis that question. Like, ask everybody. We know this happens. We know it from Becker's work. Becker didn't find it. When I went to sit down and talk to him, I told him, I said, Palm sees what did it. It's melanin. Melanin creates a huge amount of electrons. That's the DC electric current. That's the major part. When you had Siegfried on, he said, well, I don't know where the rest of it comes from. Well, you do, Logan. You do. It comes from melanin. Melanin is animal photosynthesis. That's what separates your sun from them damn tomatoes out in the garden. They only have chlorophyll to work with. Turns out your sun, it's got about fucking 100 different chromophores that do all kinds of crazy shit in him. You've learned about a lot of them. Encephalopsin, melanopsin, neuropsin, all right? Rhodopsin,
Yep.
hemoglobin, cholesterol, leptin. These are all animal photosynthetic chemicals that work to create this bioelectric current that Levin talks about, that Becker talked about, that even Jerry Pollack talks about at some level, but nobody seems to take all of this together to figure out, well, how do we keep Logan's son in Arkansas healthy? Well, Doug Wallace told you that answer. Even he's part of this story. So is Nick Lane. Turns out the bioelectric feedback on that optical density gives you feedback on the environment. When your son gets cancer, it's telling you as his parent, the signal's incoherent from outside in. Change that, fix that. That's the key. And when you do that, then you find out that, when you take them to the University of Arkansas and the oncologist tells you this, that, and the other thing, you're like, okay, this was good, but maybe this wasn't. You start thinking about it a little bit differently. That is what a decentralized savage does. And remember, I always try to tell people this. Everybody says that, medicine is in the United States is really far advanced. Remember, centralized medicine is the third leading cause of death in the United States. That's not my work. That's the Institutes of Medicine's work. Here's the crazier reality for Dr. Michael Levin, because I'm sure he won't like what I'm about to say. He told everybody on Twitter that non-native EMF is bullshit. Well, somebody should introduce his sorry ass to the NTP toxicity study. The people that fund him spent $25 million and proved that 3G networks cause cancer in mammals. He now has a duty to explain that based on what he said to Alexis yesterday on Twitter. You have a duty as a podcaster to hammer that point home with guys like Chafee, with guys like Siegfried. Say, our government is telling us that there's a link when they fund studies like this, and then they come out of the other side of their mouth when it suits them on the financial side that, oh, no, it's safe to use a cell phone and put it right up, in your head or close to your asshole. And you wonder why you get acoustic neuromas or you get tinnitus or you get colon cancer. The answer's staring you right in the face. But the thing is, you got to ask the next question. See, they're hoping, remember, when you censor material, it keeps you from asking that next question. That's the point that I'm trying to make to you. It's the single biggest missing aspect. If Elon Musk and Joe Rogan are right, that we're going to get the best information from podcasts going forward, then guess what? What I'm telling you today is the single most important thing. Don't censor the guests and ask every question you possibly can think of. And then go back and say, well, this is where my guest stopped. Therefore, that's about as far as we can go with the advice that he gave us or she gave us. Then we need to go to another level. So where that stops, you go. If you look at my Twitter page, what does it say? I begin where allopathic medicine and functional medicine end.
Oh.
That's exactly what I do. That doesn't mean I know everything, but I will tell you this. My science goes way past their science. That I can tell you.
Yeah, we know. As we wrap up, I get a lot of messages about you from very, very big named people in the world that follow your work, are very receptive, and it makes me think of something that you said about Paul Saladino, about how his followers told you that he agreed with you, and you were like, then why don't you say it, right? And I actually think we're at the cusp of a lot of people saying it, and that's because of you. That's because of the seeds you planted and your relentless pursuit of the truth.
Well, I'm going to tell you, a lot of people thought that I was going to French fry Saladino like, Lane Norton did, and said, this guy became a millionaire selling a carnivore book, and now he's eating, fruits and nuts and ice cream in Costa Rica. I look at it like this. Paul has actually upgraded his game. He's beginning to realize that light really is a bigger effect than food. So if you think I'm going to rip a guy apart, when I can actually see from the outside in that he's actually making the correct changes. No, I'm not. I'm not going to do that. But the reason I get angry with guys like Dr. Tro, he contacted me on Twitter, said, look, I want you to be on the podcast. And I said, I'm not going on your podcast because you're not ready for me. I said, you get Alexis first. Alexis went on the podcast and she said, look, the guy that was with Dr. Tro was wiser than Dr. Tro. Why? Because you remember something. Dr. Tro's mindset, it's all about food and exercise. Why? Because that's what he did. That's his worldview. I'm not in this game to change his worldview. I'm in the game, for someone like your son who's got cancer. Your son can eat exactly like Dr. Tro. That ain't going to make his cancer go away. Now, that's also not what Siegfried believes. Siegfried believes that Paul Saladino is more likely to get cancer because he likes pineapple and oranges. I don't believe that. Why? Because he lives in Costa Rica at the 9th north latitude. Thomas Siegfried lives in a shithole in Boston. So they don't even realize how their environment scales to this discussion. They still don't understand how food scales to the environment. But see, that's where you come into this. That's why I was kind of angry when you said, I'm just a simple guy. You're not. You're a fucking farmer. Dude, you're if you don't realize that you're the connection between guys like me and the food gurus. You're the one that, hey guys, I grow the food. I can't grow coconuts and pineapples in Arkansas. Jack's really not lying. I can't do that. It's physically impossible for me to do that. So if it's physically impossible for me to do that, unless I do alien things to my farm, don't you think it's a reasonable question? Why are we selling this stuff in Arkansas in the Whole Foods? I don't think that's a difficult question, my friend.
No.
Even for a food guru to handle.
Eh.
Or, when Anthony Chafee comes on and say, why is it that most of the lamb comes from New Zealand? Do you think it's a good idea to eat New Zealand lamb in Arkansas? Maybe that's a problem. Why? I know Anthony Chafee has no earthly idea that the nuclear spin of lamb from New Zealand is radically different from the lamb if Logan decided to start growing lamb in Arkansas.
And we do. So, like, I own a farmer's market. I own a grocery store, and I build out local food systems, right? Like, and that's what we do. And I think if you took a look at my business page and my work, I think you'd be proud. But
I'm already proud. I'm trying to tell you that you downed yourself in this podcast, and I don't want you to do that. You're the perfect guy to go in between the food gurus and the biophysicists. You don't realize that. You actually are the transformer of these two branches of science. Why? Because your farm is the laboratory that Dr. Levin and Dr. Pollack are talking about. Like, their labs aren't as good as your labs. They're not.
Do you know why we ramped up lamb production?
Tell me.
You saying that it was the highest DHA content of what we could grow, and I wanted it to be local.
Yeah. Well, there you go. And it is. It's probably the best red meat, if you want to know the truth. That's the way I look at it. But it does have to be local. And it kills me because I live in a country now in El Salvador where the only lamb I can get is from far away. So I can't make it a staple, of my life. I mean, I'm trying to offset the last 3.5 years of going back in to the hospital to find out the real issues about COVID. And that's kicked my ass. Yeah. But, I'm done doing that. I mean, the last 2 years, I've told everybody what I found and where the issues are. So I'm done with the politics now. I'm finished dealing with them. I think they're all a bunch of fucking schmucks, if you want to know the truth. I don't trust them. I never will. And I think that we, the people, need to hold their feet to the fire and give them no quarter. Like, give them no issue. Just the way I am with food gurus, I am now that way with politicians. I've actually come out in the Bitcoin community recently and said I no longer trust Michael Saylor or Cynthia Lummis. Wow. That's a big statement, okay?
It is.
Doesn't mean that they're bad for Bitcoin. It just means that they're not good for self-custody. They're not good for the people. They're good for the ecosystem, but not for us. And I've told this to many people. Self-custody is a loyal title. When you have total control, you control everything in your life. That's actually the story of how you get your son well. He needs to control his environment extremely well so that cancer doesn't come back and nobody steals his time. Because it turns out everybody that's in that Arkansas Medical Center is banking on your son getting sick so that they can make their Mercedes payments with their shitty fiat money. That's actually what the system is gained for. And until you realize that the system is not set up for you, our hope right now is that Bobby, Jay Bhattacharya, Nicole, the people that are in DC under Trump's cape are going to do at least some of the good things that we're talking about here. Great. But do I trust any of them? No. Now, this is where I tell you I'm from Missouri. Show me. I'm not interested in the fucking talk anymore. Show me.
Thank you, my friend. I really can't express gratitude enough. But sincerely, thank you. I'm gonna keep putting in the work. I'm gonna keep trying to learn and apply. It's a lot, and your work has changed my life. So tell Chantel thank you so much for setting everything up, and y'all have a wonderful, beautiful day. I'm jealous at what I'm seeing in the background with that beautiful sun.
Yeah, it's actually pretty nice here today. They're all out on the back deck, all sunny. I got like 5 or 6 people out there.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Kruse.
All right, take care.